you going to be the new potentate?
Before we begin the video, here's a mandatory spoiler alert. This video is a no-holds-barred discussion of a focal aspect of the DLC's narrative, so if you haven't beaten the DLC yet, you should do that and come back to this video afterwards. By now, we all know that Shadow of the Erdtree is absolutely brimming with new lore. There's new weapons, armor, items, questlines, boss designs, architecture, customs, cultures, and practices that are pulling our attention in every direction. More interesting than Mikola and his chosen consort? More intriguing than Saint Trina's role in the story? More astonishing than the lion dancers, and the old lady who gives us stew because of how their costume smells, is the way that From Software has shed light on the nature of what in 2022 the gamer called Elden Ring's most adorable character. From does this by offering insight into what's really happening as we were, quote, helping them discover their inner warrior along the way. From somehow takes what seems to be the most wholesome interaction in the game, hell, maybe the only wholesome interaction in the game, and transforms it into a narrative containing one of the most gruesome body horror storylines they've ever told. Why does Marika order the Elden Ring of her age such that there's no death? Why does she pluck the rune of death from the Elden Ring, establishing the Golden Order? Is it, as some have pondered, to suffocate the Erdtree of runes, halting the influence and power of the Greater Will? Or is it something less sinister, less plotting, and more human? Now, if you've made it through the DLC in any capacity, you know a few things. You know about the jarring ritual, the horn scent, the empty shaman village, and so on. You may even think the bit about the jars is fascinating, but it can't be that important, right? You may have already seen other lore videos which, in my opinion, only point out the obvious. We'll go over the basic narrative threads again here, in great detail, but I'm also going to outline some conclusions that we can draw with the information we have that aren't quite so obvious. These conclusions have huge implications for our understanding of the world of Elden Ring on the whole. In big part, this video explains why the ritual, which involves stuffing a people called the Shamans into jars, is the motivation for Marika's betraying the horn scent, the horned humanoids found throughout the Land of Shadow. This ritual is the reason she needs to hide her Royal Omen children Mohg and Morgott, the reason she accepted the Greater Will's offer of godhood and power, and the reason she grafted the Erdtree onto the crucible. It also caused the wars in the Lands Between and the Land of Shadow, multiplying the suffering of each land thousandsfold. At the end of the video, I'm going to offer a unique view of what follows from the obvious information presented to us in the DLC. Ultimately, the Golden Order's genocide against the ideology of the Crucible and the erasure of the aspects of the Crucible in retaliation can all be traced back to this divine ritual. This ritual, perpetrated against her people, turning them from what the Horn Scent see as unholy, unhorned beings, into what will come to be known as saints. Bloated bodies, stuffed into jars, after being condemned, jailed, tortured, and sliced up into viscera, in a way, harkens all the way back to the research hall of Bloodborne, where people are subjected to horrible sets of experiments, which are hoping to allow them to communicate with the Great Old Ones. It's unclear, but perhaps by turning shamans into saints, even by breeding them for this process, they're doing the same thing. Perhaps the Horn Scent are hoping to connect with their own outer gods. For me, the jars in the Lands Between have always been incredibly interesting characters. Once I found out the jars were a pivotal aspect of the DLC as well, I couldn't help myself. I had to dive right in. So, what do we know so far? Well, we know Marika's coming to the Lands Between and establishing the Golden Order occurred on the back of the destruction of an ancient culture who put the horned creatures up on a pedestal. For example, the modeled necklace tells us that horns are sublime artifacts to Horn Scent, and their presence confirms the belief that they're a chosen people. Moreover, the fine crucible feather talisman tells us that the Horn Scent view the crucible as sacred for the refinement wrought through its evolutionary gifts, most prominently, their tangled horns. But why did she destroy this ancient culture? Large-scale holy wars usually aren't perpetrated for absolutely no reason, even if the reason is poor or unjustified. What is that reason? Upon closer inspection of the Land of Shadow and its inhabitants and tales, it seems that, in virtue of thinking they're a chosen people, the Horn Scent dehumanized the Numen, or the Shamans, in order to enact a slow genocide via chilling ritual which begins at the Whipping Hut near Bonnie Village, and ends with our Tarnished helping the young Jar Bairn, the warrior Jar Alexander's nephew, to find a new potentate for the hidden village of Jarburg. So, what is this ritual, and how can it possibly be responsible for the untold suffering found spread out across the lands between and the Land of Shadow? Finding out requires making our way to Bonnie Village. Bonnie Village is the home of the Hornsent. We first begin to learn of Bonnie Village and the trauma that it caused its own inhabitants via the new cookbooks, the Greater Potentates Cookbook. According to the item description, the cookbook is a record of crafting techniques of the Greater Potentate who roamed the lands near and far. Moreover, this potentate was haunted by the grotesque practice of his village of birth, forcing him into a life wherein he stuffed great pots with all manner of things. In other words, instead of filling pots with people, he tried different crafting materials. This led to the creation of hefty firepots and the like. So, what are the potentates? Well, think back to Jar Bairn and his ask of you on his quest. Will you be the new potentate? Interestingly, Jar Bairn's request comes with the word potentate capitalized, a proper noun. In the item description of the cookbook, however, it's lowercase, a simple category of persons. While the bureaucracy of potentation is unclear when comparing the potentates in the Land of Shadows to the request made of you in Jarburg, one thing becomes obvious as we make our way through Bonnie Village. The potentates, smooth hands or not, are a brutal sort. As an aside, just the word potentate is an excellent bit of wordplay, as potentate is a real word which means monarch or ruler. FromSoft, however, are using it as a play on the suffix ate or -ate, which means to denote offices or functions or rank on the one hand, such as consulate, while on the other hand, means to possess or have the appearance or characteristics of, such as in the word fortunate or passionate. This perfectly captures the etymology and the bureaucracy of the potentates. In the lands between, the potentate with a capital P turns on the first meaning, showing that the potentate is a monarch or ruler of Jarburg with a high ranking, while the potentates in the Land of Shadow turn on the second definition. They're literally giving people the adjective pottish or pot-like as they turn them into pots or jars. I've always loved the name and thought it was super clever, but we couldn't have known the full meaning until the DLC released. Firstly, when we acquire the potentate's weapon, the Bonnie butchering knife, we come to realize that potentates are essentially human butchers. This is nothing new. Every FromSoft game has some version of the cannibal and the butcher. Think back to Mildred, the man-eater, for example. We also know that without potentates, there are no living jars, so it makes sense that the inhabitants of Jarburg would be looking for one. They can't reproduce without them, and their numbers are dwindling, as more and more jars are broken at the bases of minor Erdtrees by the avatars, and by us, the greater the needs are for New Age potentates in Jarburg. According to its item description, the Bonnie butchering knife is an outsized butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jar stored in the jails. Like a few other weapons, striking an enemy rewards you with a small amount of HP in return. It has the property of lifesteal, hinting at the Hornsent's ability to play with the vitality of others. Moreover, its unique skill, Hone Blade, is said to perform a stroking action to sharpen the blade, honing its cutting edge and increasing the amount of HP recovered. The greater potentates treasure the tools of their practice. The potentates, then, are a high-ranking class of Hornsent who carry out the ritual which turns the viscera of the people they condemn, jail, torture, and butcher into living jars. This ritual, however, requires a lot of focus, and so, aside from their butcher knife, they all wear the particular headpiece, the caterpillar mask. According to the item description, it's a grotesque mask constructed from countless solidified caterpillars, a ritual implement of the greater potentates of Bonnie Village, used to ward off thoughts of impurity, doubt, temptation, and other wickednesses one's vulnerable to while absorbed in divine ritual. So what exactly is this ritual? How do the potentates, the Hornsent butchers, actually turn their victims into living jars? And more importantly, who are these people being turned into the jars? As you travel through Bonnie Village, you cross paths with the greater potentates, wielding their butcher knives. You pass the weeping shadows of the Hornsent. You cross over deteriorating suspended bridges, one all but completely collapsed, and finally come up to a small, decrepit shack called the Whipping Hut. It contains an item that, I think, may have the most brutal item description in the game so far, the Tooth Whip. The item description reads as follows. whip bestrewn with rotting, misshapen teeth. Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen, they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. The whipped and wounded shamans, bound together, are ultimately butchered into a kind of magical viscera that has the power to bring the jars to life. This viscera is known as innard meat. The item description of innard meat reads, "Scraps of flesh for filling great jars. Rancorous spirits cling to the pinkish-red twitching meat. Throw at enemies to inflict damage. This is what becomes of the condemned, who get sliced up and stuffed into jars to become saints instead." Now, I won't say much here, and I'm leaving it for another video, but it's worth mentioning that there are only two other saints we know of in the game, Saint Trina and Saint Ramana of the Bud. What to make of that, we aren't quite sure. Perhaps, like the mimic tears the Nox are using to generate a lord in the lands between, the Hornsent of Bonny Village are trying to make their own saints by combining people together. Next to the whipping hut is a spirited Hornsent who speaks the following words. "For pity's sake, your place is in the jar. Nigh sainthood awaits you there. For shamans like you, this is your lot. Life were you accorded for this alone." Now this is simply conjecture, but the last bit of this, the life were they accorded for this alone, leads me to believe that the shamans were more or less bred to be put into jars. Once the Hornsent know of their vitality abilities, their abilities to be bound together at the flesh, they use this ritual against them, trying to generate saints. An ominous, gruesome picture of the potentating ritual begins to take shape. A people called shamans are seen only as fodder for jarring. This is their lot, and they're only given life insofar as they're to be enslaved by the Hornsent, taken to the whipping hut, and lashed by the greater potentates with the tooth whip. This gives them wounds which then become inflamed and oozing. Something in the style of the human centipede. They stick the shamans' bodies together at the wound, binding them until they heal into one another. The flesh of the shamans, after all, is said to meld harmoniously to others. This is kind of a primitive grafting, in my view. The real question, though, is who are the shamans, and why is this their lot? The shamans are the people who used to inhabit Shaman Village in the hinterlands before they were wiped out due to, shall we say, overjarring practices. But someone incredibly important hails from Shaman Village, Queen Marika. We know this because this is where we find the minor Erdtree cantation. Its item description reads, "Secret incantation of Queen Marika. Only the kindness of gold, without order. Creates a small, illusory Erdtree that continuously restores the HP of nearby allies." Marika bathed the village of her home in gold, knowing full well that there was no one to heal. Only Melina can use this incantation in the base game, and she does so during our fight with Morgott if you summon her aid. Walking through the Shaman village, we see the flickering specks of gold as described by the incantation, with wistful plucks of a harp as underlying music. As we walk deeper through the solemn village, we come around to a dead miniature minor Erdtree with a wooden statue beneath it. Its eyes are covered. In front of the statue, we find another item, the golden braid. Its item description states, "A braid of golden hair, cut loose. Queen Marika's offering to the grandmother. What was her prayer, her wish, her confession? There's no one left to answer, and Marika never returned home." All of this is to say, after her people faced decimation at the hands of the Hornsent, Marika left Shaman Village, never to return. The DLC story trailer spoke of betrayal, and so does the Hornsent at High Road Crossing when he discusses Miquella's apology for how his mother, Marika, betrayed the Hornsent, how the Erdtree is his enemy, and how she set them aflame, likely using Messmer's armies. My question is, how can somebody whose people are being systematically slaughtered betray those persons who are slaughtering them? To me, this betrayal is not merely a betrayal as we were led to believe in the trailer, making Marika out to be a complete and utter villain. This is something akin to a slave rebellion in a way. Marika is revolting against an oppressive culture who committed a slow genocide on her people until they were completely wiped out. After all, the shamans were jailed, tortured, and grafted to each other before being butchered into viscera and turned into new creatures, the living jars. It's worth noting here that the jars we see in the lands between, Alexander, Jar Baron, the jars in Stormvale, and so forth, all have Erdtree stamped covers, while the jars in the Land of Shadow have a completely different pattern, one more closely related to the crucible. Notably, the seal on the jars, whatever it means, is the same as the elevator buttons that are found in Bonnie Jail. Maybe we'll get lucky and Tarnished Archaeologists will uncover their meanings for us in the future. This brings us back full circle to the jars we're more familiar with. Alexander, his nephew Jar Baron, and their home in the lands between, Jarburg. Given what we now know about the nature of the jarring ritual, potentates, the horn scent, the shamans, and the like, what can we say about the jars in the lands between who are seemingly unlike the jars in the Land of Shadows? Where they're similar is that they're both used as a kind of burial ritual. Life comes from death, and death from life. One difference is that the jars in the lands between can speak. Well, some of them. This is helpful for coming to understand the nature of the jars in the lands between, and thusly the nature of the jars in the Land of Shadow. Ultimately, this will offer more questions than answers about the nature of our potted friends. Jar Baron lets us in on the nature of Jarburg, for example. When we first meet Jar Baron, he says to us,
Hello, Cos. What are you doing here? I didn't think anyone knew about this place. Except us jars.
This means no humans have visited Jarburg at least since Jar Baron has been brought to life through the ritual of potentation. Who then was the last potentate? Who created Jar Baron? Who created Alexander? How long has the prophecy of the new potentate been standing in Jarburg? Was there a potentate of Jarburg before Alexander left, vowing never to return? Likewise, it's extremely interesting that Jar Baron would know the term potentate at all, given that the only way the jars could come to exist in the lands between with the stamp of the Erdtree is if Marika adopted the practice herself. In other words, knowledge of the label, the word, the term, potentate, is somewhat locked behind the Shadatree's divine gateway. There are no potentates in the base game. How does such a word travel from the Land of Shadow to the lands between? What's more, I wonder how it takes on such a different meaning. We're back to our original question, in a different form. Who are the people in the jars, this case in the lands between? If, in the Land of Shadow, shamans are required, beings whose flesh easily melds to others, then what shall we say about the practice of jarring in the lands between? Let's look more closely at the purpose of the jars in the lands between. The jars consume warriors fallen on the battlefield, hang out in graveyards, there's a graveyard near Jarburg, and in the catacombs. The jars have an explicit purpose, to automate Erdtree burial. They gathered warriors of the many wars, took their remains to the catacombs, feeding the Erdtree the runes of the mighty, and continuing something akin to the cycle of life and death, but without what one might call a true death, or a final or destined death. Everything that meets an Erdtree burial eventually returns to the lands between reborn. Godwyn's death during the Night of the Black Knives is proof enough of this type of burial, and the complete death of his soul which corrupts the roots of the Erdtree, leading to Deathroot, is all one needs to know about the requisites for the cycle of life in the lands between under the Golden Order. Now what struck me as odd is that the majority of the broken great jars we find are scattered at the base of minor Erdtrees. At first, maybe nothing seems out of place. We're so used to seeing the great jars, and we're so used to seeing the minor Erdtrees. However, upon closer inspection, the timeline becomes fuzzy. As the golden seed item description tells us, when the Elden Ring was shattered, these seeds flew from the Erdtree, scattering across the various lands, as if life itself knew that its end had come. Similarly, the item description of the Crimson Seed Talisman tells us that the Erdtree was once perfect and eternal, and thus was it believed that Erdtree seeds could not exist. The Erdtree avatars, golden seeds, and the practice of smashing the jars at the base of the minor Erdtrees all come much, much later in the story, after the shattering, as avatars spawned to protect the new brood of the Erdtree, the minor Erdtrees scattered across the lands between. How can it be, then, that the living jars of the lands between can haphazardly lap up the viscera of the fallen warriors with no discrimination, with no mention whatsoever of the type of flesh required for binding the innards together, while in the Land of Shadow, a very specific group of people must be maimed and jarred? Not only are these people specific, but they require special tools, and a very special divine ritual which requires immense focus to turn jars into living jars. In my view, Elden Ring is a story of lineage and genetics. Think of the Golden Lineage, It's also a tale of inherited traits, both dominant and recessive, expressed in terms of godhood and imperianity. And, also like Bloodborne, Elden Ring is focused in no small part on a certain piece of our bodies that we tend to associate with such traits: our eyes. Runes are eyes. Grapes are eyes. Eyes are closed, meaning certain things. Having eyes in your stomach means others. And being blind emits even more meaning. Think back to your basic understanding of genetics. Blue eyes are recessive. Brown eyes are dominant. We all know that from elementary school. From Software loves playing on our folk understandings of the world when implementing and offering us trails of lore, and this is likely no different. Let's combine what we know about the nature of who's in the jars with the view that Elden Ring is a game about genetic lineages, like many of George R. R. Martin's stories are. Given the nature of who's in the jars, perhaps something like the jarring practices of the Lands Between simply couldn't exist in the Lands of Shadow, as not everyone's flesh easily melds to others, at least not in the way the shaman's flesh does. In that case, the fact that Alexander and the other jars can fill themselves up with viscera of any humanoid in the Lands Between, and continue to grow, would have immense consequences for the genetic nature of the inhabitants of the Lands Between, and moreover, for our Tarnished as well. I already mentioned it briefly, but consider the over-discussed phenomenon of grafting in the case of Godric. Would Godric not need flesh which easily melds to others, mutilating himself and offering life to the dragon's head as he does so? Could any being except for one with shamanic lineage be able to do such a thing? Perhaps, indeed, the callback to the original practice of potentation is exactly why grafting is looked down upon by the Golden Order. Grafting, in this case, is literally diluting the royal lineage by mixing, as is done in a crucible for what it's worth, pure gold of the Golden Order with a primordial gold of the crucible, devolving the order by adding dragons into the mix. This is to say that the origin of grafting is potentation at Bonny Village. There are more practical reasons, however, for why grafting is looked down upon by the Golden Order. One example is because it causes one of the most loathsome occurrences in all the Lands Between, the existence of rancorous, vengeful spirits. Under the Golden Order, when someone dies in the Lands Between, they're either prevented from returning to the Erdtree, or their souls return to the Erdtree for a rebirth. An example of such a prevention is found in the seedbed curse of the Dung Eater. On the other hand, Erdtree burials and rebirth are a very common practice. What if, however, Erdtree burials and rebirth aren't only a spiritual phenomenon? What if they're a partially genetic phenomenon? What if, with every rebirth, a bit of Marika's golden genetics are imparted onto everybody who gets an Erdtree burial and returns back to the Lands Between? This kind of tree birthing ritual, after all, is exactly what we should expect from a tree-worshipping people that Marika descends from. Even in Shaman Village, the most important landmark is that of a grandmother, a sculpture carved into what looks to be a perishing minor Erdtree where Marika cuts her braid, leaving us with the iconic image of her hairstyle. Now, Godric is obviously related to Marika by blood, and Marika's shamanic lineage gives her the genetic traits capable of animating a jar where she herself potentated, so obviously Godric can graft. If everyone in the Lands Between can participate in Erdtree burials via Great Jar consumption, then nearly everyone in the Lands Between is genetically related to Marika in some degree. The picture of the Lands Between, then, is an exact mirror of the Land of Shadow. In the Land of Shadow, Marika is the last of her kin, as suggested to us by the item description of the Golden Braid. In the Lands Between, however, everyone is her kin. Everyone is related to Queen Marika. Queen Marika has established more than a Golden Order, a construction of the Elden Ring, and a royal lineage. Marika has, in the vein of Genghis Khan in the real world, established a thriving culture wherein she saved her people who were pushed to the brink of extinction by procreating over and over and over through Erdtree rebirth. The rebirthing process has the Erdtree assigning the souls of those who have had Erdtree burials back into new bodies as they're born. This is something of a Platonic image of the cycle of death and rebirth, as is found in his famous dialogue, the Phaedo. We know that natural, biological parentage still exists in the Lands Between, but we also know that souls are recycled. This soul recycling is how inhabitants are prevented from dying true deaths in the Lands Between. This is, after all, the purpose of plucking the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring when Marika founded the Golden Order and gave herself over to the Greater Will in exchange for the powers of godhood in order to exact revenge against the Hornsent. This means that everyone is spiritually and thusly genetically related to Marika, such that they can be turned into jars. Everyone from the Jar White puppet to Kenneth Haight can be stuffed into a jar upon their untimely demise, growing the jar, adding to its vitality, and then the jar can saunter to a minor Erdtree only to be crushed by an avatar, spreading its innards to the roots of the tree, providing it with the visceral sustenance it needs to grow. By now, the claims of my thesis have been validated. The ritual responsible for bringing the living jars to life by mixing innard meat with vengeful rancor spirits through the divine practice of potentation is responsible for the immense suffering found in both the Land of Shadow and the lands between. Had the Hornsent not committed a religious genocide against Marika's people, the Shamans and Shaman village, Marika never would have brought the destruction wrought by Mesmer. The reason for the genocide is not genocide per se, but a dehumanization process wherein the Shamans, due to their hornlessness, are meant to partake in a transmutation which turned them from unwanted, unholy, condemned beings into saints. What does this mean? Well, let's return to the ghost outside the whipping hut, who says nigh sainthood itself awaits you within. While there are more items which point at what happens within the jars, the companion talisman helps us to understand this a bit more clearly. Though the jars are brought to life by human flesh and blood, they're all rather kindly folk. Perhaps they were made to be better than their innards. The purpose of jarring, then, is to make morally superior beings than those who went into the jars in the first place. In Marika's case, this means imbuing the people of the lands between with gold and grace with every new Erdtree rebirth. The genocide committed by condemning the shamans' bodies to torture, inflicting upon them purposeful disease, binding them together, butchering them, and stuffing them into jars, bringing those jars to life, helped to alchemically create a slave race of pot, which could be used to the benefit of the Hornsent, whether as producers or warriors. But ultimately, in the eyes of the Hornsent, they would be cleansed beings, saints, free from the lowly life of hornlessness. As an aside, during my research for the meaning of saint here, if you search Buddhist saints, it points you to the Arya. Arya is a term used in Buddhism that can be translated as noble, not ordinary, valuable, precious, pure, and rich. Arya, in the sense of noble or exalted, is frequently used in Buddhist texts to designate a spiritual warrior or hero, something like Alexander. What makes this particularly interesting is elsewhere, when the perfumers are discussed as poaching the jars, we find that the jars are also thought of as noble. Perhaps, like elsewhere in the game, the term saint is something of a dodgy translation. Marika's extreme hatred for the Hornsent, and thusly the Crucible, is the catalyst which causes her to betray the people in the Land of Shadow, much as a slave owner would think of his property betraying him if the enslaved person were to rebel against the norms of their era. This betrayal occurs because of the seduction of the Greater Will, offering Marika a seat at the table as a god, granting her the power to obliterate her enemies. Unfortunately for her anti-horned propaganda, which is baked into the Golden Order, some of her children would be born with horns, the Omen twin. The fate assigned to Morgott and Moog would set the rest of the events in motion for the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. This betrayal, which is mentioned in the DLC story trailer, Marika's turning to the Greater Will, grafting the Erdtree onto the Crucible, solidifying the Golden Order as the reigning order, and the removal of the Rune of Death from the Elden Ring, likely because of the fear of losing anyone else close to her in the way that she lost everyone in the genocide in Shaman Village and the Bonnie Jail, is based on what one might call good reasons. While Marika is often made out to be an extreme villain, a cold, distant mother, a tyrant, and a monster, see, for example, the unfortunate situation of Blacksmith Hugh for more on that, it seems as though the snowball effect, which caused her to reach out to powers greater than herself for her own preservation, were caused by people who resemble the beings we're conditioned to empathize with in the base game, the horned beings, the secret omens and the sewers, and anything which is Crucible adjacent. Aptly, or perhaps ironically, the jars themselves are crucibles. They're ceramic containers in which bodily substances are alchemically melted down over time. Another definition for crucible is a severe trial or tribulation, wherein different elements interact, leading to the formation of something new. Even more ironically, the use of the term crucible around the time in the real world that the word Erdtree, as we've seen it spelled in the DLC, would have been pronounced Erdtree, the meaning of the term crucible would have been used to describe a crucibulum, or a night lamp which hangs in front of a crucifix. Such a description should immediately bring Marika's crucified body to the forefront of your mind. So Marika, in her endless wars against the Crucible, and in her attempts at homogeneity of the world, ends up becoming that which she despised so much, a crucible in her own right. The crucible that Marika becomes sees her giving Erdtree burials to all the warriors in the lands between, donning them with grace and gold, entering them into her golden lineage, thus combining them with herself and making something new. The lands between, in a way, is just a giant jar, with Marika as the greatest potentate. Now that you know the origin of the suffering of the lands between, next time you're in Jarburg and Jar Baron asks if you're the next potentate, what will you say? Do you think your hands are smooth enough? What do you think about the potentation process? Did I miss anything? Did you stumble upon any other information in your first run through the DLC that solidifies this, or shows that it might be false? Leave a comment below, and as always, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. If you want more content like this, let me know what you'd like me to investigate in the Land of Shadow next. See you soon.